Good morning on the 15th of March, 2024. Finally, we're at the Ides of March. And what better thing to talk about on the Ides of March than the two things we have to talk about today? In this live stream, we'll focus on the first thing, which is a new reading of the alleged prophecy of St. Malachi. And then my regular news video, if you want to call it that, today, going live in just under an hour from the time we're starting this broadcast, is the next installment of We Were Warned. So guess we're going to have the Prophecy Friday. I didn't plan it this way, but then I found this article that we're going to talk about. A priest in Italy, who I have brought you his letters before, has a new letter to the public, a new article that he published in Italian at Marco Tossati's website, and I'll show it to you here in a moment, where he gives a new reading of the St. Malachy prophecy. And I say alleged prophecy of St. Malachy because I don't buy into the St. Malachi prophecy. Honestly, most of it seems dubious. The prophecy, allegedly, was found 3 centuries after the passing of the saint it's named after. The descriptions of the popes that it has throughout history were pretty on the money until the ones after the passing of the saint. And then suddenly they get a little more Nostradamus-like, a little more ambiguous, and you can read into them the more you like. Its description of the Pope they say is Benedict XVI is very sketchy. I mean, they call him the glory of the olive because the Benedictines had a branch called the Olivets, but Joseph Ratzinger was never a member of that. So again, it's dubious. It really is. People tend to latch onto it because the Pope in their description list prior to Benedict XVI is a tied to a eclipse of the sun, and they say that's John Paul II, whose birthday was allegedly on a solar eclipse. Okay. Because you can generally verify that, they then latch onto that. But then you get to the elephant in the room. And I'm going to show you the elephant in the room with the St. Malachi prophecy and why I don't tend to believe it. We'll just go to the version of this that comes from CatholicTradition.org. Note here, they don't actually put the one that comes after Benedict as Francis, because I don't think I'm pretty sure they don't believe Francis is the Pope. But I have seen people call Francis Petrus Romanus. Okay, so I'm going to show you this description from the St. Malachy prophecy of Petrus Romanus. And yeah, so in the translation, because they provide the Latin in the translation, it says, in the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church that will reign, Peter the Roman, who will feed his flock among many tribulations, after which the 7-hilled city will be destroyed and the dreadful judge will judge the people. The end. That does not sound like Francis to me. It doesn't. Now, you can get around that by saying the see is vacant, adopting the Bene Papist hypothesis that Benedict was the authentic pope, and we are now in an interregnum waiting for the conclave that will elect a predecessor. And that, according to this prophecy, it means we're going to get a holy pope who will guide the church through the final tribulation. Another reason I don't buy the St. Malachi prophecy personally really is that, well, I've read a lot of Catholic prophecy, and it just doesn't line up with the rest of it. And that doesn't mean it's wrong. It could be the rest of Catholic prophecy is wrong. There are people who dispute the great Catholic monarch and the angelic pontiff prophecies that basically say we're heading right now towards we're in a spiritual chastisement now that will culminate in a material chastisement where God will essentially start civilization all over again, basically, and that in the rebuilding of it, a monarch from the line of monarchs in France will restore Christendom to Europe, and he'll work with a holy pope. And for a generation or so, there will be the reign of the Immaculate Heart before sin sets in again, and then the arrival of Antichrist. That's another one. And you see that theme throughout Catholic prophecy. Various mystics have talked about that. So they're almost competing. And that one seems more probable to me. But again, I could be wrong. I am no prophet. But here is this new reading. And I'm not going to read it from Marco Tossati's website because I wanted to make sure I got this translation as good as possible. And the Google Chrome translation extension is okay. It does the job for basic things, but I don't trust it for something like this. So what I did, this is written by Father Joachim Heimerl. I'm hoping I'm saying your name right, Father. But this was published just a couple of days ago over at Marco Tossati's website. He was Marco Tosatti is the Italian journalist who initially was handling a lot of Vigano's letters before Vigano started his own site, and he still publishes them when they come. It's to give you an idea, but Marco Tosatti is an Italian journalist who has a lot of connections to in the Roman Curia, a lot of those early whispers of documents coming from Rome. He'll be one of the first to report on them. His work is very good. And he also handles Catholic prophecy really well. I've generally covered some things that others have written on prophecy that he's published. But what I did is I took that article and I ran it through the best translator on the internet to get a bit more accurate one. So Father Heimerl gave it the title of Francis and the Darkness of the Church, the Papal Prophecy of St. Malachy. And his main point here is that most people have misread the St. Malachy prophecy because they've included in their timeline of popes a couple of anti-popes, which throws the whole thing off. By his math, we've got another 3 popes before this gets fulfilled. But there's more to it than that. And so we're just going to go over this and we'll comment on it as we go, because this changes a lot of the substance of it. So, Francis and the Darkness of the Church, the Papal Prophecy of St. Malachy. Rumors about the Pope's health are intensifying, and the next conclave is evidently in the air. Many are reminded of the medieval papal prophecy of St. Malachy. But what is it about, and what do we know about St. Malachy? Certainly, it is certain that he was abbot of the Irish monastery of Bangor and later Archbishop of Armagh. He died in 1148. His prophecy includes 112 sayings about the next popes, who are not mentioned by name. The last pontificate is followed by the Last Judgment. What seems adventurous today has been considered a forgery since the 16th century. The possible authorship of St. Philip Neri was brought up, however, this theory was later debunked. As we know, the painter Duccio de Buonsuena depicted Malachy in the Majesty of Siena Cathedral between 1308 and 1311, with the list of his mottos in his hand. It can therefore be ruled out that Philip Neri, who lived 200 years later, is a pseudo-Malachy. The prophecy must actually date back to the Middle Ages. German historian Hermann Heire also broke the falsification theory some time ago. Moreover, he corrected the previous assignment of pontificates to sayings by eliminating some anti-popes. This created a new situation. If Francis was the last pope before, now 3 more will follow. However, this also means that the end times would begin with Francis at the latest. Let's pause. Does that seem more plausible? That there are 3 more, because things can get worse. There's a lot that is almost like the consensus of Marian apparitions and other Catholic prophecy that doesn't line up with St. Malachy's prophecy with the more normal reading of it. That Francis may have been the last pope before, but now that there will be 3 more that will follow. And that is if you include Francis as the pope. If you don't, if you believe that we are an interregnum right now, that means there would probably be 4 more that will follow. That's an interesting thought. Let's continue. According to the interpretive tradition, a cosmic catastrophe would occur under the next pope, while the penultimate pope, penultimate meaning next to last or next to highest, the one that will be the glory of the olive, might come from the faith of our elder brothers, or more likely among that group of that specific group of people, symbolized by the metaphor of the olive tree in the epistle to the Romans. He is followed by Petrus Romanus, under whom there will be a persecution of the church and the destruction of Rome. What is particularly interesting is that the darker meaning of the prophecy now appears in the new count above Francis's pontificate, De Mediate Luna. This suggests the influence of the crescent moon, that religion, or the people moving around a lot. But all of this is certainly insufficient. A divided pontificate with a sitting pope and a pope emeritus is also out of the question as an interpretation. The moon is not a figure for papal office, and as we know, there is always only one pope. In Latin, de mediate luna means not only from the middle, but also from the center of the moon. Seen in this light, this could be a pontificate exclusively under the sign of the moon. But what does that mean in medieval prophecy? We'll pause here again. If this sounds a little bit like astrology to you, yes, Catholics are forbidden from practicing astrology, but the weird thing is, it was in the Middle Ages, there were people authorized by the church to understand astrology and to understand the movement of the stars and things, because actually, while we're forbidden from doing what the pagans do with astrology, we're told to keep an eye on the movements of the stars and the moon and stuff. Watch for the signs in the skies. We've been told that many times. I'm not saying go find your local astrologer. Please don't do that. Okay. And if you've ever mixed around with them, maybe go to confession about it. It might be one of those things. If you haven't confessed, you should go do. But here he's talking about this is, again, we're getting into some medieval practices here. He says, even this question cannot be answered unequivocally because the symbolism of the moon remains ambivalent. It may represent the Virgin Mary and the Eucharist, but it may also have the demonic symbolic content. Therefore, it seems important to me to see the motto in the context of the whole prophecy. There, the moon is followed by the sun, and night by day. In other words, de mediate luna describes a dark and threatening pontificate. Let's pause. Does that sound like Francis to you? Yeah, it sounds like Francis to me. However, it is necessary to make a clarification. Malachy's mottos do not refer to the categorization good pope, bad pope, but to a label for the state of the church and the world during the respective pontificate. An example is Pius XII, to whom the new categorization applies the motto Ignis Ardens, burning fire. It can be assumed with good plausibility that this refers to those events from the 1940s. Can't say that stuff on this platform. My apologies for those who who insist that I say the things I'm not supposed to say and lose my channel because it for some reason really gets into your skin, but I'm not going to do it anyway. However, to understand St. Pius as the pope of that event or the pope of the other event would be absurd. However, those events dramatically overshadowed his pontificate. Ignis Ardens is thus a very clear statement about historical context, but not about Pius XII personally. But what might make the lunar saying about Francis's pontificate? It is striking that, with its obscure meaning, the prophecy anticipates an equally prophetic saying of Paul VI, who in 1972 spoke of the smoke of Satan entering the church. The content of De Medietate Luna presumably goes in the same direction and points to a particular demonic influence. We are undoubtedly living through one of the most difficult pontificates in recent centuries, in which everything seems to have fallen into diabolical disorder. This includes the beginning of the schism in Germany. Well, we can no longer rule out even a Roman schism if, for example, the Pope were to introduce the ordination of deaconesses. Ultimately, according to many, we are facing a pontificate of confusion, a pontificate of heresy. After all, Francis was the first pope to bless practiced James Martin stuff and tolerate idols in the Vatican. The demonic darkness in the church has never been greater. It remains to be seen whether after this lunar period a new era will begin with the next pontificate, De Labore Solis. However, it is doubtful that this saying really refers to a cosmic event such as an asteroid. In the context of the prophecy, another interpretation is more likely, namely that the situation in the church will brighten, at least until the last pope, Petrus Romanus, sits on the chair of Peter. By then, at the latest, the darkness of the church, as we are suffering under Francis, will have been overcome. Now, that's his reading of the alleged prophecy of St. Malachi. Of course, hanging over all this is, what if Francis isn't Pope? There's a lot of competing theories about explaining why he wouldn't be, none of which have the backing of the church, obviously, at this time, but that's his reading, that Francis is the Pope of darkness, meaning that the next one will be a Pope who will shepherd a more brighter time in the church, which begs a question. Can you see that happening? A brighter time in the church? I know many people think Francis will go to his judgment this year or next year, that we are on the verge of a conclave. I suspect he'll be around longer than most people expect him to be. But there are many people who think that both in the church and in the world right now, we're about to turn a page on things, that you see social movements going on, backlash to things that the forces of evil are doing out in the world. And you see this growing in the church as well. And that maybe we'll get a brief moment of respite before things get bad again. Again, I'm not a prophet, but I can see things going on in the culture that give me at least a measure of hope. But again, I could be wrong. I'm not necessarily endorsing this one. Again, I've never really bought into the prophecy of St. Malachi. But it is interesting. It's definitely, this one is a much better interesting or much more plausible reading than the straight reading of it has been, because at least 2 or not 3 anti-popes had been included in the actual St. Malachy prophecy in the normal reading of it, according to this priest. David Wilson, Francis is the first pope that hasn't been ordained under the old rite. That is noteworthy. It really is. Catholic Arrow says real astrology describes the story of redemption. Virgo is Mary, the Virgin Queen. The lion is Jesus. The scales are our judgment, etc. These are the hidden meaning of the star signs. The Magi knew this. Right. And this is why some Catholic figures that I respect got in trouble because they demonstrated how to do astrology and astrology related things because they understood it. But the reason they spent so much time understanding it and knew how to the point where they knew how to do the secular version of it is because they had made it a point in their life to actually talk to the people who wrap themselves up in this stuff to try to get them to convert, and had great success. And people tried to destroy them for it. It really made my skin crawl when I saw what they were doing to them. So I just want to make sure people know I'm not endorsing astrology, but you have the correct answer there. This is what the Magi knew. But that doesn't mean you and I should go dabbling in things. There are things that, we should stay in our lane, as it were. Damien Keller says other prophecies have to be taken into account. Triumph of the Immaculate Heart according to Fatima, the period of peace, roughly 20 years. Right. So what if the next Pope does the consecration properly and we see, this brightness in the church could be a whole new meaning, because that may not be a time of good things socially. After all, the triumph of the Immaculate Heart would come with it necessarily the defeat of the influence of Satan in the world. Well, think about that for a moment. Think about the implications of that, given how far we know his influence extends. It would be probably catastrophic. A very difficult time, at least at the beginning, because things are understood in spiritual terms. It would be a spiritual triumph. More people would probably have the opportunity, would have an easier time to take advantage of the graces offered by God than at any time before the rise of the satanic influence in the culture, going back who knows how far, but specifically a century at least. It's not counting bad popes, Matthew. Anti-popes. Anti-popes aren't bad popes. Anti-popes are not popes at all. That's why you don't count them. They're pretenders. They don't have the charisms of the papacy because they're not popes. They're just pretenders. That's why you don't count them. But then this pope being an anti-pope doesn't count, says Nola. Well, again, no one in any position to make such a ruling has actually made a ruling that Francis is an anti-pope. People are using their informed judgment as Catholics to say that he is. But I would be surprised if a future pontificate didn't make that ruling. At the same time, I would kind of be surprised if they did, because it would cause such chaos. It's the next good pope we get will be between a rock and a hard place on what to do about this pontificate. But no one has officially ruled him an anti-pope. No one has. I know a lot of people get solace by saying, I don't have to pay attention to him because he's clearly evil. But that hasn't happened yet. And it's one of those things that that may never happen. He may never be declared an anti-pope. The prophet says he will be an outsider Jesuit order matching the prophecy. Well, again, the problem is when you read Petrus Romanus, there's no possible way Francis is Petrus Romanus. There's just no way. Because when you read Petrus Romanus, here we go. The final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will reign Peter the Roman, who will feed his flock among many tribulations. After which, yada, 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 bad things happen to Rome. That's not Francis. He's not feeding his flock. He's feeding his flock to the machine. Catholic Arrows, current mainstream astrology is demonic. Like so many things in the world, that the world has taken it from the church. Yes. It's sort of like a lot of like evil imagery. The people you can associate with evil imagery, which then causes like some Protestants to flip out on the Catholic Church because they see the same imagery used by the Catholic Church. Think of the cross of St. Peter, or gargoyles and demons and skulls and things. Like, oh, look, it's evil. They're worshiping Satan. I'm like, no, memento mori is a thing, as is the cross of St. Peter. These are just taken by the secular world. Raymax says, and what Holzhauer wrote seems to align with what Blessed Aunt Catherine Emmerich wrote concerning a new 12 and a new church age, ostensibly under Peter. Quite possibly. You can align this prophecy more with this reading of St. Malachy prophecy with greater Catholic prophecy much more easily. Because 3 pontificates could be 45 years, could be 50 years, 60 years, depending how long each of the next popes reign, including how long this eclipse pope reigns, the current one. if he reigns, I mean, again, people assume he won't make it to 2025 or 2026. You don't know that. And I find it actually kind of ghoulish that people do try to predict how long Francis will be around for. The promise of peace would reflect the conversion. Yeah, the Guadalupe, right? I mean, you get like a hint of the future with Guadalupe. You want to see what the reign of the Immaculate Heart will look like. Look at what happened at Our Lady of Guadalupe. But imagine that now on a all worldwide scale, basically. All right, folks. Mikey Boss says almost all previous anti-popes have been deposed while alive. Most of them, yeah, except for the time during the Great Western Schism, and their entire line was declared anti-popes. But yeah, there is that's one of the problems you're going to have with like Francis. If he's an anti-pope, he's a unique anti-pope because no other anti-pope in history would have been accepted by all the cardinals, all the bishops except a couple of retired ones, and sedevacantist bishops and things. But the rest of them, I mean, no other anti-pope had the consent of the universal church like this one does, if he is an anti-pope. That's why I've never called him anti-pope Francis, because that is a dangerous limb to go out on, I think. Do we really think anyone would make the claim of anti-pope? He's surrounded by toadies who would never condemn him. Well, if he's ever made one, it'll be in the future by either a bishop who's alive now and becomes a cardinal and becomes pope 20 years from now or something, or perhaps the next pope if we get a pope of restoration next, although I kind of doubt it. Daniel says there's a curious historic letter dated 1871 from Pike to Mazzini, infers conflict in the world is I've read that letter. I can't put it on YouTube though, but I know what you're talking about. DK says Petrus Romanus could be martyred as the first pope was and be Roman as in Roman Catholic as in not just Universalist. I mean, if you want to read the Petrus Romanus one, I think you're going to find that Peter the Roman is probably an Italian, possibly from Rome. He may be a bishop who is an archbishop somewhere else in Italy at the moment, but was born in Rome. Maybe his name is even Peter. Imagine a cardinal. I mean, if Pietro Parolin became pope, then you might want to be worried. To give you an idea. Again, not necessarily endorsing this reading of it, though, but it does make more sense than the prevailing one. Laura says the era of peace will follow after all this madness already. Yeah, that's generally my reading of Catholic prophecy, too. There's a through line in all of it. It's why I eventually plan to do a synthesis of non-Marian apparitions like my Marian apparition video I did. I won't be obviously covering every possible one because that's going to that would be a multi-hour video. And then after that, maybe some sort of overall synthesis. All right, folks. Any final thoughts? Are there any Peters out there now? Yeah, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who does not fit the bill also of Peter the Roman, because I can't imagine that guy being the one who will feed the sheep during the tribulation. Noli says if there's an anti-pope, there are anti-cardinals. That's what's interesting about that is when the Great Western Schism was ended, all the anti-bishops, what you would call anti-bishops or anti-cardinals, all the people elevated by the anti-pope who reigned at the time, were recognized by the new pope. Said they were valid. So I don't know. Damien Keller says, my understanding of the timeline of prophecies is the illumination of conscience, 3 days of darkness, triumph, rise of the great monarch, and Holy Pope, 20 years, then judgment. 20 years is the part that I'm iffy on, because my suspicion is it's more like 20 years of what they call good harvest, and in spiritual terms, that means this is a holy period, right? And then after that, you get back to degradation. Probably because after the material chastisement, the people are rebuilding and they get the infrastructure back up. Like the key infrastructure that really sent the world spiraling, which was the communications infrastructure. Imagine people rebuilding things, and they find an old, internet server system somewhere that is in remarkable shape, and they manage to get it working again and rebuild the internet. And the server system has got all the nasty stuff on the internet you can imagine. Imagine that scenario, what kind of effect that would have. It's just it's a hypothesis of mine. Probably won't be around to see it though. Anyone take into account 5 red heifers? I mean, not necessarily. You know why I don't take it into consideration? I don't take into consideration anything that people do to try to force our Lord to come back. There's this weird movement of among Protestants to certain Protestants to fund the rebuilding of the Third Temple because they think they can basically force the events as they read them of Revelation to happen. And that strikes me as not only evil, but just incredibly misguided. All right, folks. Are any final thoughts on this? Let me know in the comments. Get your ideas in now. I will put a link to this in my show notes at returntotradition.org. I'll probably want to. I expect LifeSite will probably publish this. They've published the last couple things by this priest, so when they do, I'll try to post that too. But they haven't done it yet. It's an interesting read, though, isn't it? At the very least, it's interesting. Daniel says, just being aware of bad things happening in our church gives some comfort. Well, it should. After all, the adversary really only, he really only goes after the Catholic Church in this way because the others are not the real deal. So, can I do a video just on what are anti-popes? The anti-pope, there's a whole line of people who claim to be pope in the Great Western Schism who had dubious claims. I would do videos like that, but nobody would watch them. They really wouldn't. You want proof of that? Go look at how generally my weekend educational videos go. I once did a video on explaining papal infallibility, and in the history of my channel, it's one of the worst performing I've ever done. I was surprised. But yeah. All right, folks. Fleabita says only 91 likes to 381 watching. Yeah, go ahead and hit like if you can. That'd be great. It would help a lot. Anyway, folks, thanks very much for tuning in. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.